Virtual power plants are an aggregation of distributed energy resources, things like rooftop solar, storage, electric vehicles, smart water heaters, smart thermostats. And our view is that's going to be a $70 billion market by 2030. So the big question is, how is that value going to be shared between utilities, aggregators, and customers?
Your trusted source for information on the energy transition. This is the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Hello, energy leader. This is Chris Sass, host of the Insider's Guide to Energy, and I ask for just a few moments of your time to make you aware of a brand new program that I think you'll be excited about. The program is called Podcast Power, Media Training for Energy Leaders. And you're probably already aware that podcasts are a dominant force in the media today. As an executive in the energy space, you are often asked to be a guest on a podcast, and your legacy media training leaves a lot of gaps in the skills you need to be successful on a podcast. Common sense doesn't always do it. And to avoid these pitfalls, Insider's Guide to Energy has partnered with the Antenna Group and their media trainers to create a hands-on interactive 2-day workshop designed for executives in the energy and clean tech space specifically. You'll get all the skills you need to have successful interviews and to reach the audience you intend to reach. So whether you're reaching out to customers, future employees, or investors, this is the class for you. Space is limited to the first 10, and those that are selected will get the opportunity to be a guest on the Insider's Guide to Energy, practicing your new skills. Welcome to another edition of the Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is my co-host, Jeff McAulay. Jeff, we're going to talk virtual power plants today. This is an exciting topic. What are you thinking we're going to do?
Wow, VPPs, one of my favorite topics. Very excited to get into this, and we're lucky to bring back on the show Michael Levy, the U.S. Networks lead at Baringa, who has a new report out on the wonders of virtual power plants, all the reasons they're cool, and maybe why we should all care about them more. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back, guys. Really looking forward to the discussion.
So, Michael, refresh us just a little bit. What is Baringa, your role, and why are you putting out such great content?
Right. So Baringa is a global management advisory company that specializes in consulting and advisory services for energy companies. We're about 2,000 people globally, many of which are in the UK, but we've got a very quickly growing business in the US. I run our US networks practice, which is just the UK term for transmission and distribution operations. So virtual power plants and everything related to the grid edge falls squarely within my remit, and we're really excited and bullish on the amount of value that VPPs can provide our clients and customers.
Great. And I think this is in the common lexicon, but please do, if you could give us your version of a definition. And you've got some new terminology, some more accessible terms that I really like in your report. Walk us through what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did reference a report. We recently released a white paper that was in collaboration with Kavala, who's one of our key partners. A virtual power plant is really an aggregation of distributed energy resources. So if you think about electric vehicles or rooftop solar or storage or things like smart water heaters, smart thermostats, anything that can the amount of load that it consumes or can discharge excess energy, that is, and it can respond to some sort of signal, that is potential, and it's behind the meter. That is potential for aggregation for a virtual power plant. So the idea, and virtual is kind of a misnomer because it's not actually virtual. It's a real plant. It's just decentralized among many assets.
Great. And you talk about what I love here is the shift, the shimmy, and the shed. Walk us through those functions.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I could take credit for that names, but I've got to give it to my friend Jen Downing from DOE's LPO, the Loan Programs Office. They also recently released a report, a liftoff report focused on virtual power plants, so I'd encourage your listeners to take a look at that. But the idea is that different types of behind-the-meter assets can provide different types of services to the grid. So when we talk about shed, that's a reduction in load or demand. Shifting would be moving demand from one time to another. So that'd be like an electric vehicle or battery storage. Shedding would be more things like traditional demand response, like a smart water heater or a thermostat or an industrial load that's flexible. And then shimmy refers to more ancillary services like frequency regulation and helping balance inertial imbalances from renewable integration. And then lastly, of course, you have generate, which solar assets can produce power, and then that net excess power that's not being consumed by the customer, that can be pushed back onto the grid for consumption by others.
And the dig here against the virtual power plants, and maybe you're right, you should just call them distributed energy resources or distributed plant or aggregated power plants, is that they're not, quote, dispatchable, or they're not firm. So is that a valid criticism? And how would you think of the virtual aggregated power plants as compared to the more traditional centralized model?
Yeah, great question. So if you think about the different types of assets that I listed, whether it's electric vehicles, all the things that come under DER, so solar and storage and other types of dispatchable backup power, it could be a diesel generator, it could be like a Generac. And then of course you have like traditional demand response assets or direct load control. Direct load control and anything that's incorporated with storage, that is dispatchable. So really the only one of those that's not dispatchable would be solar, and that would be solar, distributed solar if it was in isolation. Now, it's important to note that unlike a power plant, these assets in many cases are serving multiple needs, often providing a utility to the customer, right? So just because your EV is dispatchable, if you need it to be charged because you're about to drive to work, then obviously there's restrictions on that. So there's additional like a customer behavioral aspect to the way that, like, the amount of value that's available to a utility. Yeah.
So if I'm an energy user and I'm listening to this and saying, wait a minute, power plant, that's my stuff, right? You're reaching into my thermostat and my water heater in my car, and like, I don't want you to do that. Why should somebody, an end user or business, be okay with participating?
Also a good question, because you can save money. So in many cases, these assets, the way that they're being dispatched, whether it's a shed, depending on the type of service they're providing, shed, shimmy, shift, or generate, it goes unnoticed to the customer. And actually the intent is that when an asset is responding to an event or providing some sort of grid services, it is within the boundaries of the convenience and choice that the customer has. So from your perspective as a customer, it's like, well, do I want a $20 or $50 bill credit and I don't even notice that I'm doing anything different? It's kind of a no-brainer for them.
Right, and there's also, talk to us about the resilience improvements. Distributed assets versus centralized.
Yeah, so maybe it's worth actually just talking about, we said these are the different ways that the assets can respond and add value to the grid, but it's worth explaining like what that value stack looks like. How are those services actually monetized? And in the paper we talk about three different really main categories. One that is related to the bulk power system for generation and transmission. So you have reduction in demand, you have capacity, you have potentially energy arbitrage, which is trading based on price differentials, and then ancillary services, that's the shimmy thing that we had talked about. With the implementation of FERC Order 2222, which requires all the different independent system operators to allow behind the meter assets access to those services, ISOs are being forced to define what those rules are in order to be in compliance with that rule. So that part of the value stack is going to have to be available to customers. And different ISOs are in different levels of maturity in terms of their implementation timelines, but they should be in compliant within the next couple of years. The next part of the value stack, which I actually think is the largest of the three, is network deferral. So if you think about the grid as, flowing electrons, but then also you have the network that has the capacity to carry those electrons to the consumer. If the consumer is using less power or shifting it so that it's off peak, then now the capacity of the network doesn't need to be as large. And so if utilities are able to defer the upgrading of a substation transformer or the capacity of a line, that has benefit, right? Because they would have spent that money to make the upgrade, but since the demand was shifted or shed, they no longer have to make the investment. Monetizing that actually is a bit more controversial and requires close coordination with the utility, and we're still in the very, very early stages of that. And then the last, which are less often monetized, but I think still very important, the last category is related to resilience. So if you think, in many cases, customers are buying these assets exclusively for the purposes of backup power. You look at what happened in Texas with Hurricane Beryl. There were 2.5 million customers out around Houston, and you better believe that folks are going to be looking pretty hard at potentially purchasing backup power because they don't want to live through that again.
Let me go back to your investment conversation, because your white paper covers it. It talks about deferring a substation, I think, for 10 years and talk about future value of money to get a better deal on the capacity. I understand today with demand growth that we maybe want to defer things, not even for economic reasons, just because we may have more demand than capacity at times. Do the consumers even really look into this? That's a utility statement, right? When the example you gave in your white paper was the utility deferring. Are the consumers aware of this kind of savings, and are they getting future value savings as well?
Yeah, also good question. So when we talk about network capacity deferral, usually that's sort of coined under this term non-wires alternative, which you guys may be familiar with. There are very few examples of where NWAs have been shown to be economic, but I think that that's for a couple of reasons. It's not because they actually aren't economic, it's because the incentive structure actually is designed that utilities don't want to do NWAs. They make money by spending money, so it makes sense that they would want to continue to upgrade the network. That said, the utility is still responsible for maintaining the reliability of the network, and so often they'll claim that behind the meter assets are unreliable, and therefore they can't count on the customers behaving in an expected way, or responding to a price signal or event, and therefore they have to make the upgrade. But many pilots that have been deployed, and even other VPP aggregators that are operating at scale, have proven that not to be the case. So I think we're still in the very early stages where utilities and aggregators are working much more closely together to actually find those opportunities where they can defer capacity investment, and they feel confident that there won't be reliability issues later on down the road.
Is that getting to the ratepayer then? Is that trickling down?
Right, I didn't answer that part of your question. So in the case of an NWA, it's this concept of gain sharing. And the idea is that if you have a substation that you would have upgraded, but instead you're paying everybody to have a power wall in their garage, then there's some deferral value. There's some value from deferring the capacity upgrade. Rather than the customer keeping all of those savings, the NWA construct is the utility would actually gain share in that deferral value, and that actually gives them an incentive to make the investment that may be less traditional.
So what's new here? Virtual power plants, if you're talking about demand response, is not new. We've had smart water heaters for decades. What are the new elements that are making VPPs more attractive, more monetizable, more valuable to different stakeholders?
Yeah, great question. So if I think about, you're absolutely right. Everything that we've talked about is not new. In many cases, it's been around for decades. I think the big difference between a VPP and, say, like a traditional demand response program is the spatial resolution at which events are called and then the frequency. So this isn't your mom and pop DR program where you're calling, one or two events a year just to address the peak. You can systematically be addressing very localized peaks at the grid. And in fact, we're actually seeing a divergence between feeder level peaks temporally and the bulk power system peak, which kind of supports that argument I was making before around a lot of the value being around distribution upgrades. So that's one point. The second point is that a lot of these assets are being bought by customers irrespective of whether they're VPP enabled, right? And so you've got all this latent untapped capacity. Our estimates are that it's around $15 billion today in the U.S., and that's actually expected to grow to around $70 billion in terms of potential value by 2030. And then the third point that I'll make, which I think is maybe the most important of the three, is that unlike traditional generation, that the costs grow basically linearly, that VPPs are software enabled. So every asset that you add, the normalized dollar per megawatt hour actually declines exponentially because it doesn't cost 10x to have 100,000 customers enrolled versus 10,000 because it's software that's enabling these assets. And so if you think about, as demand is expected to grow from electrification and AI and EV adoption and other things, then capacity becomes increasingly expensive. And so that spread between greater VPP enabled assets and then the cost of capacity is going to continue to get bigger and bigger over time. And that's why I think, that's why our view is that this market's going to grow so rapidly.
You talked about assets that are deployed but not enabled. Why is that? If VPPs are so great and this is so valuable and beneficial to the system, is it an individual consumer or business level opt-in that people just don't know they can, or is there some other barrier to adoption?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, actually, is like people have a smart water heater and they may not even be aware that there's an aggregation program that would pay them to, pre-cool or preheat the water, or preheat the water at a different time during the day that's off peak, and that can save them, a handful of dollars, that would add up throughout the year. In many cases, it's just lack of awareness. But I think the aggregators that are coming out, and in many cases, utilities that are looking to enable these assets, they're taking advantage of it too. So I think that's a big part of it. Another part, which the LPO does a good job of outlining as a barrier, is there's a lot of these different assets, types of assets, and so there's inherent complexity in decentralization, and similar to all the different EV chargers and all that stuff, there's a lack of standardization. So there's a bit of technological complexity in terms of having a standard way to aggregate lots of different types of assets that can respond in a predictable way.
I also think that the deployment will vary, right? Individual, if you're trusting the ratepayer or from a bottoms up, or from the user perspective, some people are going to go gung ho and put a power wall up, and some people are going to have a lot of smart appliances, and others may choose not to. So I'd imagine it's fairly inconsistent across the market.
Yeah, I mean, it's the rate of adoption is often based on the incentive structure that's available, and also just power prices, right? As prices get higher, then the incentive to offset that also grows. And so if you look at places like New York and California and Massachusetts, it's probably no surprise that they also have high rates of DER adoption because customers want to offset their bills, right? I mean, there's also like a sustainability and clean angle that we haven't talked about a ton. These assets in many cases are actually reducing emissions or reducing renewable curtailment from centralized generation. So there's an angle of that too, but I think predominantly it's driven by high prices.
We talked about some of the benefits. We talked about some of the challenges. What's on your wish list? Is the gap? You wish there was some magical smart home controller. It's a product gap. It's an end user awareness that everybody just magically opted in if they had a battery and didn't know that they could enroll it. or is it a regulatory construct that stitches together all these disparate markets? Just offering a few, but what's on your wish list?
That's a great list. That's a good list. For me, like top of the list actually is that utilities were more diligent about appropriately valuing these assets and considering them as investment alternatives. I'm not going to sit here and say that every feeder has an NWA possible, but it is surprising to me that there's been so few instances where that's been deemed economic, and I think a large part of that is because the business cases are not being appropriately crafted based on the value that they can of those assets. So, I would like to see utilities share in that value also. If they are creating a market that saves money for customers, they should be rewarded for creating that market. So that would be the top of the list for me.
You talk in your white paper about the regulation. You talk about the FERC 2222 regulation. How are we set up to make this successful? Because it seems a little bit, I get the feel that you're positioning all the good things that it can be. Virtual power plants have been around for a while, but you're saying they're underutilized, or there's 15 billion going to 70 billion potential value that's untapped. How's the regulation keeping up with this, and what needs to happen at both the state and the federal level to make this more interesting or more likely to come to fruition?
Yeah, 2222 is a great first step. I mean, I sort of orient because the value stack that we've described, we haven't necessarily said how that's shared between the participants in the VPP system, right? You've got the customer, you've got the utility, you've got the aggregator, you've got the wholesale market participants. So there's enough value in there that everyone can share in that pie. And until the regulation allows them to do that, then it's not in their best interest to enable the value of those resources. So 2222 unlocks the generation and bulk power system part of that value stack. I'd love to see regulation that's focused on unlocking the T&D deferral. And we talked a little bit about resilience on the last podcast with you guys. And that increasingly is going to be maybe an unmonetized part of the value stack that's driving adoption. But allowing customers to capture other parts of the value stack beyond just the main driver, which might be avoiding having a week without power because of the bad weather. That's going to accelerate adoption. And the other thing too that I'll add is, if you think about from a resilience perspective, these assets are decentralized, and so that in of itself is more resilient, right? If supply is co-located with demand, there's fewer points of failure in between. And so, like a great example of this is if you look at Puerto Rico, right? They're basically rebuilding the grid from the ground up after what happened several years ago, and they are covering that place with microgrids and with behind the meter solar and storage. And because they know that the grid is going to continue to get battered by really, really strong hurricanes, and that's okay. That's what you get in the Caribbean. But having a decentralized grid makes them it gives them the backup, right? Yeah.
Michael, can we explore that a bit more? Because I think it's a natural point that people get. Okay, there's a power outage, the power plant goes down or the transmission line goes down. I'm going to have my personal home backup, whether that's solar, battery, generator, and my personal EV that can run my home. But I'm not sure that people can as easily make the leap to say that if 30% of the people in a community have solar, that makes everybody more resilient to outages. How would you better articulate that?
So is your question on a debate of like resilience for community solar versus VPP assets?
Or is that true? Just do the DERs of individual homes make more than just that home resilient? Is it 1-to-1, where if you just have 100 homes with 100 backup generators, then each one of those individual homes is protected? Or is there some sort of herd immunity where if you get a sufficient level of distributed generation, it makes the entire group more resilient?
I see. In the case of like a really bad out, generally you're not going to size solar to go on your roof to be supplying the rest of the neighborhood, because that probably wouldn't be economic, or even permissible probably by the utility. So I think in the case where there's a bad outage, then yeah, likely it's just that you're going to be providing enough power for yourself. However, if you've got net excess generation during those times that aren't during extreme events, then that can help offset both network capacity and also bulk power system upgrades. That those costs would be socialized with other customers.
Michael, it strikes me that we might be talking about different forms of grid stress. We've talked about the different types of solutions or ways in which VPPs can provide grid services, but what kind of grid stress events are we talking about? That could be a power outage at the power plant, let's say Winter Storm Uri. That could be a ice storm or hurricane knocks out power lines. That's the T&D. And then we could just have a hot summer afternoon when everybody's running the AC at the same time and there's not enough juice to go around. It's a peak day. Can you talk about how VPPs might create community resilience in each of those three cases?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe to even break it down more simply, you could describe them as events that require load shedding and events where you're not physically connected to the grid because a line is down, right? So in the case of load shedding, you're absolutely right. If you have excess generation, then that reduces the need for load shedding. So many customers can benefit from that. In the case of a line being down, then you're probably limited to providing your own backup power, or at least those that are like adjacent to you, depending on how your system is sized. And then the last point that I'll make, which I think is noteworthy as in terms of utility restoration, is if you are able to produce your own power and the utility is aware of that, that means they can focus restoration efforts on customers who are more vulnerable. So you're saying like, look, we're good, we got power ourselves for now. Go take care of that senior living facility that is running on a backup generator and is going to run out of power themselves.
Yeah, so we've gone kind of the gambit. We've talked about the technology, the shedding of the load. We've built the economics. Where are we now in the evolution of virtual power plants? Jeff and I have both said we've been talking about them since the beginning of the podcast. We've had folks on early on. Where is the industry? Where do you think it's headed in the near future?
Yeah, if you look at, I was actually staggered to hear this. We were talking to a company that is one of the largest VPP aggregators in the U.S., and they said that they're calling 10 events per day. So it's just a staggering amount of activation of these resources, and I think you're going to see more and more of that, particularly as 2222, fourth quarter 2222 comes to fruition, and then the other parts of the value stack grow. So as the adoption of these assets grow because they are declining on the cost curve, because people want to have backup power from resilience from growing severity and frequency of extreme weather, the capacity cost is also going up because of increase in demand, and then you've got regulation that's now supporting more parts of the value stack. All of these are really, really good tailwinds for VPPs. What I would be really encouraged to see is utilities and aggregators working very closely together, because I think the size of that pie is large enough that utility shareholders and customers can all benefit. And my worry is that if one side has a more adversarial relationship with the other, then customers will not receive as much value as they otherwise could have.
Can we talk about underserved populations? You mentioned in restoration, maybe serving underserved communities, but a lot of the resources that we're talking about are often labeled as toys for rich people. There's the smart thermostats, the batteries, the EVs. So yeah, you've got your wealthy homes with all the electrification, and they're getting even more money and incentives through these VPPs. How do we make sure that distributed generation is actually equitably distributed?
I'm not sure that this is the only answer, but I think a key element of that is creative financing, right? So if you think about all that value stack that I had mentioned, in many cases, these assets can be self-funding. They just need capital up front. So I can see a world where you've got aggregators that are deploying assets in the field, and then there's an agreement where they share in the benefits of the VPP. So the customer's basically getting a new smart water heater for free, right? And then once the loan is paid off through the VPP savings, then they get to continue to enjoy the savings thereafter.
I couldn't agree more, and actually that feels like a great place to wrap, because we've really covered a huge arc here, which is what are VPPs, how are they constructed, where have they been, where are they going, what are the constraints, and some of the reasons to be optimistic. So Michael, that's a huge amount of ground to cover. We really appreciate you taking the time today, and great to have you on the show again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to see you guys as well.
Audience, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you really are interested in it, read the white paper. There's a link in the show notes. It will take you to the paper. It will give you a lot more background than we were able to cover in 30 minutes. I think you'll find it interesting. And we hope to see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy. Bye for now.